a pastor and a philosopher walk into a bar.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so we like to ask our guests when we get started because bar is a part of the theme of our show. If you have anything you're drinking at the moment or an adult beverage of preference that you'd like to tell our listeners about.
Well, I'm feeling boring right now that I'm just drinking water because I just got back from a bike ride not long before we started talking, and I'm trying to rehydrate. But I'm a big cider fan. It was the first thing I ever drank because I was in the UK. I was actually in the UK right after I turned 18 and right after I turned 21. So it was weird that I ended up drinking a lot of cider while I was over there, and it became my drink of choice.
That's a good place to go for noteworthy birthdays. I mean, I think you're like 30. You probably I think you passed 30, right?
Yep. 30, 34.
Did you go anywhere for your 30th birthday special?
Oh, my 30th birthday was when the book came out, literally on my birthday.
Oh, wow.
There you go.
So that was the main thing.
You're doing a good job hitting the milestones, Austin.
Yeah.
Any recommended ciders? My wife is gluten-free, and so she's limited on alcoholic beverages. She can't drink beer. So cider is one of her go-to things, but most of them are pretty boring.
Yeah, the main like nationwide ciders are pretty boring. You really have to go to the places like the small craft breweries to get specific kinds of cider. There's a cidery near here, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. Is it called 13 something or other? It's over in Minneapolis. I'm based in St. Paul. And they make a blackberry cider that is amazing. Like, it's not too sweet. It's just this hint of blackberry in it. And it's so good.
That's the thing with cider, often careens into the sugar.
It does. And that's the thing, is I really like a dry cider. I'm not like, if it's too sweet, I want to be able to have more than one. So,
right. Well, we're not too far from there. We make it over to the cities occasionally. So,
oh, nice.
I'll check that out.
Yeah, we're in Milwaukee, so people will share the good Midwestern accent. Except for Kyle.
Except for me. I'm from Kentucky originally. So
fair enough.
Come out if I get excited.
Screw everything. Kyle, why don't you go for it? You got the first question on the outline.
So the book that you just mentioned is called Transforming. We have it right here for people watching on YouTube. The Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians by Austen Hartke.
It's an amazing book.
It's great. Just finished it.
Thanks.
Really, really excellent introduction to, the trans experience, I suppose, or a version of the trans experience. Really good place to start, I think, for Christians who haven't thought a lot about it. It's so ironic. It's like you're so much more generous with certain things than I would be as a
startling.
Better to be ironic than ironic, I suppose.
Yeah, but I mean, really, you're
just so kind.
You're so kind and gentle.
Yeah.
In places that you would be justified not to be, I think, and so, well done. So I want to start, if it's okay, by asking you a ridiculously complicated and difficult question, and I'm going to pretend that it's just the easiest thing in the world, and that is, what is gender?
What is gender?
And how do you understand it, and how do you understand its relationship to different things like sex? Well, I guess it's controversial whether they're even different things, so that's part of the question. Sex or things like orientation. How do you understand the interplay of those things, and how has your understanding of them evolved over time?
And maybe, Austin, if you could, in the book you differentiated between sex and gender, and that was super helpful for me. So could you start there?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with the last thing that you said, Kyle, and then I'll come back around. How it's changed, I think, has been one of the biggest and most interesting things, because we just on Monday released pre-orders for the second edition of the book. I got to do a second edition that's going to be coming out in the spring, and I completely rewrote the entire chapter on gender, on gender language, because even since 2018, when the first edition came out, the way we've talked about gender has changed. And it's not that I think sometimes people get flustered or they feel like change is happening too quickly, or like this shouldn't change at all, and they maybe get flustered by this idea of like our language changing. And it's really not that it's not so much that new things are happening that fast. It's that we're learning more about what's already existed and then coining words to explain it. So that's why the language is changing so quickly. So one of the things that I didn't do with the new edition is have that designation between sex versus gender. And so I'll tell you, this is the way that I explained it in the first edition of the book: is sex is has to do with your physical characteristics. So your reproductive organs, your hormone levels, your chromosomes, things like that. And we use the word sex for that. And then I specified that gender is kind of like how you understand yourself. It is the cognitive part, it is the social part, that is not having to do with your body. And so that was the sort of differentiation that I made in that first edition. And that's a very common differentiation throughout like gender scholarship over the past, I want to say, 15 to 20 years. We've made that distinction between sex and gender. And recently, people have kind of started saying like, that's too simple. Like, we give people that idea and they run with it, and it can be an oversimplification that can make later understandings more difficult. So now one of the ways that I explain gender, and this will show up in the second edition, is talking about gender itself as having three different facets. So you have the physical part of your gender, which again is that body part, right? So chromosomes, hormone levels, reproductive organs, both internal and external. Then you've got your gender identity, which happens in your brain, how you understand yourself. And then you've got your gender expression, which is how you sort of show that gender to others through clothing and hair and all those kinds of mannerisms, things like that. So having these sort of three aspects of gender is a little bit easier for people to get on board with and then not feel super confused later on. But that's one of the internal arguments happening in like queer theory, trans theory right now, is how do we talk about sex versus gender? Do we use that binary, or do we say they're essentially the same? Do we say they're different? How do we talk about it? So it's very much an ongoing conversation.
So when you talk about the physical aspect of gender, how do you understand that in relation to biological sex?
So the interesting thing about the concept of biological sex, like, and I'm using those words very specifically, biological sex, is that historically, even though it's easy for us to look back in the past and say, well, there are two biological sexes, realistically, the concept of biological sex has been intertwined with things like race and class in very specific ways. That means that biological sex, as we think about it today, doesn't exist exactly. For like, you know, throughout the early days of the US, when people like Black African folks were enslaved, we had ideas about the fact that there was no such thing. When you talked about a man, you meant a white man, a white cisgender heterosexual man, for lack of other words. And a Black man was seen as having essentially a different gender than a white man in many ways because of the way that race played into those interactions. And so now when we talk about things like biological sex, we have to be very aware of the idea that that concept has been entwined with things like racism throughout the past and modern day now. So I very rarely use the language biological sex. I would say like this, I would talk about the sex characteristics that you have. I would talk about like the genotype or phenotype that you have if you're a bio person, right? Yep. So those would be the ways that I would talk about it rather than saying biological sex, just because there's way more to unpack in there than we usually have time to get into in just everyday conversation.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I'm a philosopher, so I always want to get into like the nitty gritty of it and like parse out the categories and try to be really precise about what it is we're saying and locate ourselves in the debates that are happening and whatnot. So that helps me a little bit, because there are people who philosophers who consider themselves race eliminativists, which means they want to eliminate the category of race and say it's not a real thing. And there are various ways you can do that. There are people who say it's not a real thing because there's no biological thing you can point to that maps neatly onto the categories that everybody knows as the main racial categories. And so because there's nothing in your genome like that, we might as well just say race doesn't exist. And then there are people on a different side of the debate that will say, well, okay, a thing can be socially constructed and still be real. And so just because it doesn't have a, genetic basis that we can point to that is like neatly divided doesn't mean it's not a real thing. And these classifications aren't things that people bump into in their experience, and they shape your life, so they're still real. You could do, obviously, if you could do the same thing or a very similar thing with gender, and I know that there are people, or with sex, and I know that there are people who consider themselves sex eliminativists as well, or you might call them reductionists. They want to reduce one category to the other, and that goes in both directions. And so it sounds like maybe you're tending towards I would like to reduce the biological sex category into some kind of gender and understand it as constructed all the way down. Is that fair?
Well, not exactly. I mean, I think one of the interesting parallels to that sort of like breakdown of like not breakdown, that's not the right word, the that way of sort of complex understanding of race, there's a similarity to that in like in trans and gender expansive communities where there are some people who uh believe that sex is completely socially constructed and it's not like, and we should kind of just get rid of it, like that it's not helpful, right?
Yeah.
And so there's definitely the people who do believe that way. There are also people who are like, no, I believe gender has some inherent thing in many people, not all people, but in many or even most people have some inherent gender thing, and we don't want to get rid of it. We just want to expand it.
Yeah.
And so I think you can see like within, it's funny because this is very much an internal conversation happening in these communities. And you can kind of see the push and pull between like, do we get rid of gender or do we just expand gender? Is
Yeah.
it something that there is some kind of inherent seed, or is this completely made up by our cultures? Like, so
Yeah.
yeah, it's very much a push and pull within the community.
Do you have a hard opinion on that? How important do you think that is?
I mean, I think it's important that we have the conversation. I would say that I'm much more on the side of let's expand gender, because for like my personal experience as a trans man, what I have learned about myself personally from that experience is that there is something in me that feels inherently male. If I was to say that there was no such thing, I wouldn't have transitioned. Like
Mhm.
that wouldn't have been necessary for me. And I think that's one of those things that sometimes folks who are not who don't understand trans people very well, they'll kind of make that argument about like, well, if gender isn't a thing, why do trans people have to transition? And it's like,
Mhm.
well, because whoever this person is who decided to transition in whatever way works for them did it because there is something inherent in them about who they are and how they want to be perceived in the world. So it doesn't mean that gender doesn't exist, but it might mean that we want to expand our understandings of what gender can be and what it can look like. So
Yeah.
I guess I would fall more on that side.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit about the relationship between gender and sexual orientation for listeners who might not have thought about the distinctions?
Totally. Yeah. That's like the first thing when I talk with folks. So many times when I talk, especially with parents who are like trying to understand their kids as their kids come out, the parents are like, well, they came out as gay first and now they're coming out as trans, and is trans just gay 2.0? Like, what's the deal here? And I think it's important for folks to know that like orientation and who you're attracted to is separate from how you understand your gender. Though I think of them as a horizontal line and a vertical line. Yes, they intersect and you have intersections in your life, but they are two separate things. So an example for me is I came out as bisexual when I was a teenager. That was my like I knew that was true about myself and that I was attracted to lots of different people. Um, but when I came out as trans, it was I realized that part of the reason I liked the label bisexual so much, other than it just being true for me, was that to assign myself or to take on the identity as a bisexual person meant that I wasn't saying anything necessarily about my own gender, like it would have if I had said I was a lesbian. That would have said not only something about the gender of the person I'm attracted to, but also my gender, right? So that's a moment where like orientation and gender sort of collide because of the way language works. But in general, they're two separate things. So a trans person can be attracted to, they can have any orientation. And yeah, any person of any orientation could be trans, but they're very different things.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to ask you another question, but and then I'll turn it over to Randy. I feel like I'm hogging that conversation.
Problem.
This is really interesting. So, I'm a big fan of Ezra Klein. I don't know if you've ever listened to any of his podcasts, but he recently had Catherine Bond Stockton. I don't know if you know who she is, on his show to talk about transgender issues. And
Mhm.
so she her pronouns are she her, but she describes herself as always having known from a very early age that she was a boy. And I don't know
Mhm.
why she uses the pronouns she does. She didn't explain in the show. But one of the cases that she was trying to make in the book that she wrote that they were talking about is that gender is, and this is the term she used, queer for everybody, and not
Mhm.
just for people who would use that label for themselves. But she means it kind of in the old sense of strange, unusual, and she means for like the most stereotypical cis hetero guy in Wyoming, right?
Mhm.
Like, it's queer for him too. because there are always limits that you bump up against when you try to be honest about your desires and
Hmm.
about what you want in life. And there are always, even for, stereotypical cis American males, where there's like prescriptions for the sorts of stuff you're supposed to be interested in and the sorts of emotions you're allowed to show and what context you're allowed to show them. And many of them are just odd. And an example that Ezra used in the show, which I thought was very helpful, was he remembered being a little boy who had a best friend who was also a little boy. And they got in the car together to go somewhere, and he reached out to hold his friend's hand. And his mom very gently said, you know, boys don't do that. And
Hmm.
then he got older and realized that in many cultures they do,
Hmm.
right? In like Middle Eastern cultures, it's not uncommon, for example.
Hmm.
And I remember having a similar experience when I was much older. I was actually in grad school, where, I mean, it's different, but similar, closest thing in my experience that I could reach for, which was I've always been a kind of really into accessories kind of guy. Like,
Hmm.
when I would dress up to go in to teach or whatever, I would always have, my friend liked to call them bangles, but I would always have like rings, and my wife makes jewelry, and so I always had stuff from her, bracelets and that sort of thing. And then I had a friend who just, we drank too much one night and she wanted to paint my fingernails. And so we did that. And I kind of liked how it looked. And
Hmm.
for probably a couple of months after that, I wore painted fingernails.
Hmm.
And I got some really strange looks from people who I wouldn't normally get them from. And I stopped doing it because it was just uncomfortable for me.
Hmm.
Went to an academic conference and gave a talk with painted fingernails, and the audience wasn't necessarily as receptive to that as they could have been.
Hmm.
And it's just one of those things, like, that shouldn't be strange. It just looks cool, and it makes me
Hmm.
feel cool when I do it, and yet I run up against it and feel like I need to conform. And I'm like, as pretty much stereotypical, cis straight guy as you could get, white, middle
Hmm.
class, Christian, whatever. And it's a little bit queer for me, even in the way that she described it. And so I just want to get your thoughts on that. Do you think she's right about that? Do you think that gender is a strange thing for everybody?
I think, like, I guess my take on it would be that, um, in a way, yes, but I also don't want to. So one of the holes that I don't remember if you all remember this from like the early 2000s or something. There was a moment there where like everybody was kind of like, well, everybody's a little bit bisexual. Like everybody's a little bit attracted to, like whoever. And we kind of just we there was this sort of cultural thing of like nobody's entirely straight, or at least there's not very many people that are. And as much as I understand that that recognizes something that is true about being human, that we all have people who fall out, like, people who we're attracted to that fall outside of what we would normally be attracted to. Like, we all kind of have that. But it really ended up kind of harming bisexual communities by making that identity feel like it was something people were just trying on for fun and not something that was real, not something that had like a real effect on who they were in their lives. So I guess I'm cautious with this idea of like gender is queer for everybody, because um like you definitely had an experience in that conference of people like reading your gender expression and treating you differently because of it, that gave you a queer experience, right? Whether that is something that is an inherent part of you and your gender, I couldn't say.
Right.
But I think it would be true to say um that there are as many gender kinds of gender expression as there are people in the world. And so if that means that gender is queer for everybody, then yes. Do I think that everybody's gender identity is a little bit queer? I don't think so. I think for the majority of folks, um, we've found ways in our culture to say that um there can be stay-at-home dads and that doesn't make them any less a man, right? And that there can be men who wear nail polish and that doesn't make them any, like, we've recognized the social parts of gender roles and gender expression that have curtailed who we are. And so we've opened those up a little bit, and the first people that do that always get shut down for it. And that is, I think, an inherently queer experience, but whether that has to do with who you are deep down, I think is only up to the individual to say.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Austin, in the first few chapters of your book, it seemed like you were trying to frame the conversation around how the church in particular interacts with trans community
Mm.
and trans individuals in particular. And you had this refrain that was going through the first couple of chapters that it's just stuck with me so much. You continually gave statistics and options of seeing and treating and holding the trans community as a part of the church or as a family or, a trans child or sibling. One option being shunning them, trying to get them to change, trying to get them to do some, conversion therapy, whatever it might be. That's one option of just saying, nope, this is sin. This isn't the way you were built. This isn't the way you were made. This isn't how God's designed for you. So stop, right? There's a middle option usually, which is kind of more gray to me. But then there's the other option of just affirming and listening and learning and coming alongside and loving and receiving, right?
Mhm.
In pretty much in every case that you laid out, the option of shunning, of saying, nope, that's a lie, nope, you're fooled, that's sin, that's the devil, let's deliver you, whatever it is, that inherently always, it seems like, leads to profound anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and sometimes even suicide. I mean, the number that you stated, which is the trans people, 40% of trans people or 41% of trans people, this is as of 2017, have attempted suicide compared to 1.6% of the rest of the population.
Mhm.
That is just unbelievable. So if you shun your trans child or sibling or family or friend, it's going to result in anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. The other side, affirmation, acceptance, love, inclusion, is startling at how much less depression, stress, anxiety, suicidal ideation you find, right?
Mhm.
And you say over and over again, and I think it needs fleshing out. It's why I'm asking you this question. You continually say, what is the most Christ-like way to go about that scenario? What
Mhm.
would Jesus have us do? Choose death for this individual who I love, or choose life?
Mhm.
It seems pretty obvious. Can you just flesh out this reality some more for us? Because I think this is a real question that we're going to bump our heads against more and more and more. And it's a question that, as Christ followers, we need to reckon with.
Mhm. No, yeah, it's it's a powerful and big thing to recognize what an effect the church has on families and what effect the church has on trans and gender expansive folks. I mean, like you said, and like I said in the book, you can trace a direct line from like non-affirming churches and theology to non-affirming families to kids with poorer mental health outcomes. Like you can trace it all the way through. And it's because like if the church doesn't provide the family with ways of understanding this theologically in at least a non-harmful way, if not a positive way, then the family has no resources. Like when the kid comes out, the family's like, well, all I've ever heard from my pastor is that this is a sin and this is Satan and whatever, you know. So there's a distinct line. The interesting thing though, and I don't like that is very we need to keep that in mind. But the interesting thing is that the opposite is also true. There's also a direct line from affirming churches to affirming families to mentally healthier kids,
Mm-hmm.
trans and gender expansive kids. That like there were these studies that came out. One was 2018 and one was 2019, I think. One was University of Texas at Austin, and the other one, shoot, I'd have to look it up. But they were looking at the University of Texas at Austin study was so fascinating because they worked with trans teens on having the different places in the teen's life where they would spend time and having that teen's correct name used. So like the name that they choose for themselves, right? So they looked at the teens at school, at home, um, at work, and with friends, I think were the four different categories. And they kind of looked through and said, like, if the teen has all four of these contexts, uses the teen's right name, how are they doing? Say only one context uses the teen's right name, how are they doing? They're kind of looking at these things.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was having the teen's right name used in even one context it was like a 30% reduction in suicidal thoughts and ideation. It was like this huge, like statistically important amount. And so I bring that statistic to churches all the time to say, what if the church was one of those contexts? What if you had school, work, home with friends, and church? Like, what if that was the only place where trans kids could be treated and seen like for who they are? And so it's a big, as important as it is to recognize the very harmful actions that can come out of this, I think it's also important to not get lost, not let the fact get lost that the positive actions that we have positive outcomes as well. And there are things that we can do about this.
Yeah. And just in case anyone's listening and thinking, oh, Austen Hartke, he's just this trans progressive, doesn't love Jesus, he doesn't care about the church. You're a church guy, right? Can you just tell us a little bit about your church chops, your background?
Yeah, I mean, my background was I grew up non-denom evangelical till I was in my early teens. So my background was very much specifically in Vineyard and EV free churches was where I grew up. And so that was very much my background. As a teenager, I really pushed back against church because I was starting to come to understand my own sexuality, like as I was getting older and realizing all this stuff that I was hearing from my church about gay and lesbian folks specifically, because we weren't even talking about trans folks back in the 90s. We like all the stuff I was hearing from them was so horrific that I was just like, this can't be right. Like, this can't be what we're called to be as Christians. And I didn't know that there were affirming churches out there in the world for a long time. And I ended up going back to church when I was in my sort of mid teens and late teens. Ended up getting baptized when I was 22 in a ELCA Lutheran church. And part of the reason that church became my home was because they saw me for who I was and they loved me for it. And it wasn't, I always talk about, like, I loved that church so much that I ended up going to during that time, and they weren't even like fully LGBT affirming. Like, they just didn't say bad stuff. Like, it was a low bar for them to get over, but it was so meaningful coming from a context where it was talked about negatively all the time. And so that made a big difference for me. After I ended up getting baptized, finishing college, et cetera, I went to seminary at Luther Seminary, which is an ELCA seminary. So I got the Lutherans got stuck with me. And my background is specifically in Hebrew Bible or Old Testament studies. And the reason that I went for a focus in that degree was because as I was a kid, folks would use Old Testament Bible passages to try to hammer home the idea that you can't be gay or you can't be trans or whatever. And I thought there's got to be another way of understanding this. So that was why I went into the program that I did. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. As part of this book, you don't just frame yourself, but you have a number of voices from the trans Christian community, which I'm so grateful you do. It reminded me a lot. Bridget Eileen Rivera wrote Heavy Burdens. We interviewed her earlier in the year, and you wrote before her, so I would say her book reminded me of yours. But these voices were so beautiful and rich, and also haunting. And I was extremely haunted by just the reality, the dehumanizing loneliness that must be a companion of kids, youth, adult, trans people. People living lives marked by gender dysphoria. You include your story even, of visiting churches while intentionally arriving late and then leaving early, and generally just trying to avoid any conversation at all as you were, coming out to yourself and then coming out to the world as a trans man. Can you just speak to that loneliness that seems like it just pervades the trans community, especially in the church?
Yeah. I mean, well, first I want to say, before I kind of expand on that just because I know sometimes people get worried, to be trans is not inherent, like being lonely and being, dealing with loneliness like this is not inherent to the trans experience, in terms of like, we're not very sad, lonely people for the rest of our lives. But, things are obviously much different once you come to a place where you are accepted and you can be your full self. But for many people, we do have to go through this period where we are coming to understand ourselves better, and yet we're not sure if it's safe to be ourselves in the place that we happen to be. And so for me, that experience of going to churches and not knowing how I would be treated was really nerve-wracking, and it did feel very lonely.
Mhm.
The feeling of going in and thinking like, I remember especially early on in my transition, I, like it was I had sort of what we call socially transitioned. So I was living as male, but I hadn't started medical transition. So I hadn't started a hormone replacement therapy transition yet. And so like my voice hadn't dropped. So I would get sirred all the time until I opened my mouth and said something. And then it automatically was like, oh, ma'am, I'm so sorry. And it was so like gut wrenching every time that happened to be like, no, you were right the first time.
Mhm.
And I would be so nervous about that happening in a church, and especially if I didn't know if the church was affirming. And so I just didn't talk for a really long time because I was so nervous. And I think that is an experience that many trans people have. I've met many trans people who've grown up in non-affirming environments, who, when you first meet them, because they are still trying to figure out if it's okay to be themselves, they're very in I don't know, drawn in on themselves. They're very quiet. They're very shy, I guess is a way to put it. And it is a feeling of like, does anybody get it? Does anybody understand? Are people going to still care about me? Are my parents going to kick me out? Are all the people that love me going to leave? Like, that's the real question. And the fact that so many people face that down and still say, but if I don't tell people who I am, I'm gonna just like, I'm gonna die. Like, the fact that people are staring that down and still realize that that's something that they need to do should give folks a sense of how important it is.
Yep.
That it's not something that people do just like on a whim.
Exactly. That's there. I'm sure there are hopefully mostly trans affirming listeners of our podcast, but I know that there's people who are just like, I don't know. And
Mhm.
also, I can't affirm that because it seems like the church hasn't and the Bible doesn't, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
And that's one of the main things that I want to say is just why in the world would a person choose to face down that kind of reaction from your family, your friends, your church, all the people that you've been told are important to you, and then hear that you're going to be going to hell for eternity
Mm.
if you go down this road? Why would anybody choose that willfully because it's a cool thing to do or a trendy thing to do or that just seemed like
Mhm.
it's the right thing to do for me because of the cereal that I ate? That's just
Mhm.
so ridiculous to me.
Yeah. And it's, and I do want to again say that like those hard times don't last forever. Like,
Yes.
there are so like seeing the difference, and this is something people said to me throughout my transition, the difference from before, when you're in that withdrawn, quiet, shy place and like you can't speak and you don't know how to be yourself, the difference from that to who I can be now, and like from to who I see these trans folks, like they come out, they do find places that affirm them, they find the support networks that they need, they get to be who they are, and it's like watching a person come back to life,
Yeah.
which is why I feel so strongly about stories in the Bible, like, Jesus raising Lazarus, and like these moments of like reanimation and remembering of a person coming back to life, because you see it happening. And that's one of the reasons that I think trans folks are so important for the church, is like, we're literally showing you what resurrection looks like,
Yes.
but you have to be able to look and notice that.
Yep. Let me skip and you had your string of questions. Now I've got mine, Kyle. Sorry. While we're on this, I'm going to skip questions, Austin, because this is kind of pertinent. One of the stories that I really loved that you shared was Asher's story in chapter 10 particular. Even Jesus had a body, and Asher lived with all of the rejection, all of the self-hatred, all of the disembodied life. And on page 133, you quote Asher, and it's might be the most beautiful lived experiences of the Eucharist I've ever heard of. And let me just read it for us. It says, this is Asher's voice here. It says, it was the first time I'd ever experienced liturgy, and it was weird and wonderful. He went to an ELCA church. What really got me was the communion table. They said, everyone without exception is welcome to the table. And I went, not thinking much of it. But then every single week I found myself thinking, I need to go back. Not because I felt a sense of duty or obligation, but because I felt it sustaining me. I felt hungry for going through the line and getting the Eucharist again. I felt like it was holding my life together. That can make me cry even right now. Can
Mm-hmm.
you speak to that experience that Asher was speaking to you?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think a huge part of it is, well, so I can't speak to exactly what Asher thought or felt, obviously, but I think from what I've heard from my experience, from what I've heard from other trans folks, there are two things that come out of the Eucharist that really draw you in. One is the sense of, through the Eucharist, through communion, becoming part of that one body, recognizing yourself as not alone, recognizing yourself as, as says in Corinthians, like nobody can tell you you don't belong. Like you are part of the body of Christ, and this shows how much that is true. And I think that's, I don't know, that's really important. I remember my first time taking communion after I got baptized when I was 22, because even though I went to a church for a while that didn't require you to be baptized to have communion, I felt like I couldn't do it in good conscience because, like, what would people think? And I remember my first time going to communion fully out, fully myself, and taking it and being like, yeah, this is just like the outward expression of what has already been done, you know? And so it's powerful. The second thing I think that's powerful about the Eucharist is all that body imagery, recognizing that this is a place where we can say that God had a body and that body was good and holy. And what does that say about our bodies? Even when we're maybe not the best of friends with our bodies at the moment, it still means something to be part of a faith that proclaims the goodness of bodies, even though maybe Christians haven't always done it so well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Last question for me for a little bit. I'll turn it back to Kyle. But you talk about this experience of identifying with people in the Bible and how that's easier or harder for some of us, right? And then you speak to this just like epiphany you had when you opened Isaiah 56, I think it was, and it speaks of God's heart for the eunuchs and including the eunuchs in the community. And then you went for a long time into Acts 8 and Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Can you tell us about what that felt like discovering those texts and just actually flesh out the text a little bit before you do that?
Yeah, I mean, to put it in a nutshell, the Bible starts out in Deuteronomy basically saying that eunuchs, or people who are castrated, should not be allowed into the community of the Lord, whatever that happens to mean. It might mean access to the temple, it might mean access to the community. We don't know exactly what it meant, but essentially saying you can't come in. And we move from that to a prophecy in Isaiah that says that God actually welcomes eunuchs, which is a weird turn that we could talk a lot about. And then moving to Jesus talking about the eunuchs in Matthew, and then moving to Acts 8, and this person who was a eunuch being, before Cornelius, one of the first people who is not distinctly Jewish, being welcomed into the early church. And so the reason that eunuchs are important for trans and gender expansive scholars and theologians today is because their experience, I mean, this is kind of coming back to our earlier question about like queer experiences. Their experiences were inherently queer, even though we can't go back and say, this is one-to-one who, like, what identity these people had. Because eunuchs, the word eunuch, both in the Hebrew and then later in the Greek, could talk about somebody who was assigned male at birth who was castrated, or it could be used to refer to what we now know as intersex folks, people with diverse gender sex characteristics. Like, it's these people who are doing gender differently in the world. And we have this huge arc through scripture that goes from exclusion to inclusion. And so part of the reason they're so fascinating is to kind of go, wow, these people had problems with like the structures of the day for many of the same reasons that trans people have problems with structures today. Not all of them are equal. We have to talk about things like enslavement, which of course is not equal, but like there are queer experiences there that we can look at and go, aha, similar experiences. Yeah. So there are also, I should say, there are plenty of trans theologians who don't love the idea of eunuchs as a predecessor for trans folks today. There's a great book called Trans Faith by Christina Beardsley and Chris Dowd, who are trans folks in the UK. And they have a bit in their book that's like, here's why we're not crazy about using eunuchs as like a one-to-one. And we can understand some ways that it'd be helpful. And then they throw out immediately like 3 other different people in the Bible that are like, hey, we think these people are actually a better example of what this might look like. So eunuchs are definitely not the only folks in the Bible with queer experiences and gender experiences outside the binary, but they're one of the ones that we can look back and we have a little bit more historical evidence for.
And it's harder to argue that one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Joseph and his, another Read the book, friends, because there's a lot of Bible in the book.
There is.
Austen doesn't shy away from the Bible. He actually goes right after it in really eye-opening ways.
Mm.
I don't want to like make you do a book report on that thing you just mentioned because I'm definitely going to go put it on my reading list. But
Yeah.
can you sum up quickly why they don't like the eunuch thing or what they think is better?
I mean, basically, they one of the points they make is that eunuch's relation to empire makes their identity very complex. One of the reasons that, and I didn't go into this in the book, but one of the reasons that eunuchs may not have been, people might not have seen them super favorably in Isaiah's time, was because eunuchs who were castrated and then went to work for the leaders in Babylon and Persia could be seen as traitors to their own people, even if they were born Hebrew. And so their sort of like political affiliation gets in the way of like it. You could make some arguments about like the other things that make them outsiders would also have been concerning to the people, and it wasn't just their gender. So I think that's their main concern, is they're like, because there's so many other things going on here, they're not like, we don't want to lean on them as the only example of gender diversity in scripture, right?
Yeah.
One of the alternatives that they suggest is actually an interesting one, because they are not looking specifically for gender diversity, but looking for those queer experiences. They suggest looking at the story of Job as somebody who does not like ask for any of the terrible things that happened to him, but is essentially treated poorly by the people around him because they believe he must have done something to deserve everything that happened to him. And despite Job having all these friends that are like, hey, Job, just repent and God will stop punishing you, Job stands firm in his truth and says, I didn't do anything wrong. Like, these bad things have happened to me, but God knows that I'm not, like, I didn't do anything to deserve this. And the experience of people around us using sort of thin theology kind of resonates. This idea that sometimes people will say like, well, trans folks wouldn't have such a high suicide rate if they just were normal, right? Like, if they like, this is your own fault that you essentially have this high suicide rate, and being blamed for your own suffering is something that Job understands, even though Job held on to his faith the entire time. So another interesting connection.
That's helpful. Thanks. I'm definitely going to read that. So you also bring up in the book, and I don't remember them offhand, but several examples of like well-known historical figures who, you know, we always have to be careful about being anachronistic. We don't want to say, you know, some Egyptian pharaoh was trans, but like there are some pretty well-known figures that it would never have occurred to me to think were non-conforming by current standards and probably by the standards of their own day. Do you want to mention an example or two of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are, well, we can go with the pharaoh to start off with, right? So Hatshepsut was the only quote unquote female pharaoh of Egypt. She built a lot of things in Egypt. She was very famous, but throughout her whole reign, she dressed, her gender expression and the gender role she took on were explicitly male. She wore a beard that was sort of I don't know what you would say, like almost a prosthetic sort of beard. She dressed in men's clothes. She acted as the pharaoh the whole time. And so looking back, we can say like, maybe she was doing this because it was the only way she could hold power as a woman. So that's possible. Maybe there was something distinctly about her that she understood herself to be more male. We don't know for sure, right? It's the same thing for characters like Joan of Arc, right? Like Joan of Arc, we look back and we have this person who was literally killed for wearing men's clothes. Yes, it was an excuse because she was, you know, in a big war and everybody was mad at each other at the time, but like she was killed not for any other reason than the fact that she was wearing clothes that weren't the ones that people thought she should be wearing. And she heard God calling her to do that. So like, what do we say about that person and what their gender might be like, right? There are so many folks in Christian history, especially, that have these interesting stories. There's this great story of Marius the monk, who I believe it was 14th century. Yeah, I believe 14th century. And Marius was brought to the monastery when he was very young. He was assigned female at birth, brought to the monastery by his father, joined the monastery, lived as a monk his whole life, lived as a man his whole life, was accused at one point of fathering a child with a local innkeeper's daughter. And rather than saying, actually, I couldn't have done that, I don't have the physical capability to do that, he said, okay, I guess maybe it is my kid. And they kicked him out of the monastery. And he ended up caring for that kid for the rest of his life. And nobody knew that he had been assigned male at birth until his death. And there are characters like that are like, these are part of our Christian history. And there's some really amazing books that have come out recently about that, about trans folks in hagiography and trans people in Christian history in general. So if people want more resources, I can point them in that direction.
Yeah, do you have like a list of resources like that anywhere?
I do actually. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Transmission Ministry Collective, and we support trans and gender expansive Christians online. So we have support groups and Bible studies and all kinds of stuff. And we just redid our website, and we have 3 very robust resource pages now. So we have one for trans folks, we have one for family members, and we have one for ministry professionals. So I can send you all those links.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes for sure. So I want to ask about something you say towards the end of the book. You talk about the need for trans Christians to grow beyond apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
And this stuck out to me because I used to be super into apologetics, but not the kind that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But that's interesting. Can you explain what you mean by apologetics, why it's often necessary for trans Christians, and what would come after?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trouble is that when you get so wrapped up in just defending the fact that you're allowed to be here, you then don't get to grow your faith beyond that seedling stage. And it's something that I've seen over and over again with folks who are asked to explain themselves and like do this work with like defending themselves and going through the clobber passages and like working through like these same passages over and over and over, and not being able to actually grow in their faith beyond that. And so I think the reason that apologetics, or like the defense of we talked about apologetics as the defense of your faith, but also in this case, the defense of your ability to exist within the faith. The reason that's important is for the individual who doesn't know if it's true for themselves. That's where apologetics is important. It's important for the trans or gender expansive person, the LGBTQ plus person who is wondering, am I allowed? Am I allowed in? Does God actually love me? That's who apologetics is for the people that need that to be able to like hold on to their faith. And it's for the family members who aren't given any better way of understanding these things, right? They need this apologetics work. So for them, it's important. But at some point, we have to be willing to move beyond talking about Leviticus and Deuteronomy and like move beyond that and talk about like, what does it actually mean to be a Christian in the world? What does it mean to be a gender expansive Christian in the world? How is that different or the same than our other siblings? So like growth in faith is stunted if we stick with the same arguments year after year after year.
Yeah. Any follow-ups?
Yes. I mean, this is just a question in response to this question, but also just in the way you write, Austen, and the way who you are. I would love to know how you stay so kind, compassionate, gracious. I would be a jaded motherfucker if I were. And you're the opposite of that. You're just winsome, lovely, just really wonderful to talk to, and it comes through so much in your writing. How do you hold on to that core of love and honor and respect and grace?
Well, I don't always. I mean, I think that's, there are reasons that I think we go to our own little communities to have conversations sometimes that aren't for folks on the outside, where you can go sit with the other people who get it and go, gosh, I just had this terrible conversation today. Can you believe they said this? Like everybody needs to be able to do that sometimes. And so it's definitely not an all the time thing. But I think for me, I mean, I'll be honest. Part of it is respectability politics. If people are going to hear you, you have to sound nice so that they will hear you. And that is not a small thing. I would like to hope that that's not, the majority of the reason why I teach the way I teach, but it is definitely a factor. If you yell at somebody, they're not going to take in new information. So being aware of that. But I think in terms of like why I still feel hopeful about all of this, why am I still part of a community that sometimes doesn't want me there? I think part of that is being really attached to and in love with this story that we're telling together, and knowing that I shouldn't have to let go of it just because, like it's the people who want to walk around with picket signs don't own Jesus. And the people who are trying to kick you out of church don't own the history of Christianity. So I think remembering that and knowing that I have just as much a part in this as anybody else is something I have to remind myself sometimes, but I don't want that to be taken away.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. Let me real quick, just on production level, re-say that, so in case we don't want to put in jaded motherfucker.
I thought about it, so I almost joked there's the E for this episode, but we're already talking about suicide, so I'm probably gonna have to put it on there anyway. So whatever.
Kyle's saying that because he wants to leave it in, but I'm just
fair enough,
just in case we don't want to. Okay,
cool.
I would be a jaded a-hole if I were you, I think.
There we go.
Okay. All right.
All right. Well,
good enough.
Yeah. And hopefully maybe we'll keep the motherfucker in there.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I'm a potty mouth pastor, Austin. I'm sorry.
No, that's fair. The number of people we have show up at the TMC support groups and they're like, is it okay to swear here? And I'm like, yes, everybody's swearing. You're fine.
Nice.
So I want to ask you about mainline Protestantism, if I can, because there were a lot of really encouraging and kind of surprising to me stories in your book of trans people coming out in their churches and to their families in mainline spaces, and finding really receptive and really affirming and really encouraging and really upbuilding responses. And as somebody who grew up in evangelicalism but was born into a mainline denomination and then left it because my parents became evangelical, and then always kind of regretted it and wondered what my faith experience might have been like if I had just stayed where I grew up. Yeah, can you just share a bit about how those churches have been beneficial to trans Christians, and if you want to name some like favorite denominations that are especially good at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think denominations are a fascinating thing, and I think when people sometimes ask me like, what's one thing I would change about transforming as it is now? Obviously, we just did the second edition, but I wasn't allowed to add like three whole new chapters. I wish I could have, but like I do focus pretty strongly on mainline traditions in this, for there are folks that came out of evangelical traditions, but nobody that's currently in one. And that's one thing I wish I could have included more. If I'd had more time, we had a couple Catholic folks I wanted to include and a couple of evangelical folks that I wanted to include. So it's not impossible to find affirming churches in those denominations, right? But in terms of mainline, the UCC has been doing a great job with LGBT inclusion for ages. And so United Church of Christ, they're, I think, one of the main go-tos in terms of denominations overall. And one of the strange things that I've noticed within trans and gender expansive communities is there is a huge movement in the last few years to the Episcopal Church. And part of that is that people are, I think, I'm a big liturgy, I love liturgy, right? So for me, I'm like, oh, people are finally discovering how great liturgy is. But I think part of that is the Episcopal Church is doing, in America, is doing a pretty good job of thinking about LGBT inclusion overall. They're not perfect, but they're working hard at it, which I appreciate. So those folks, I think, for sure. But yeah, the ELCA, the Methodists are trying to figure their stuff out right now. So that's always part of the fun. You can find affirming Presbyterian churches. I think one of the things that I love seeing is the folks that I talk to who are like, I just want to go to a church in my neighborhood. I don't care what denomination it is. I just want to go with my neighbors. And I think that's brilliant. I think everybody, if they can, should go to church with the people they live near, because that's your community. And when we drive 30 minutes to go to a church far away, even if it's some of us need to do that, right? So I'm not downplaying that, but getting to go to church in your neighborhood is really wonderful. And a lot of the times those churches are the like historical, like long, they've had a building there since the 1800s type of, mainline churches. So I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. So let me ask you about your experience or the experience of people you know in those spaces not related to LGBTQ
Mm-hmm.
inclusion or affirmation. Because when I've talked to some other I'll call them progressive evangelicals, so people who are in practice and in function and in belief affirming,
Mm-hmm.
but still want to remain resistant to the label.
Mm.
And the reason that I've gotten when I've asked is that they don't want to be lumped in with the mainline Protestant denominations because they have the sense that affirming really means A, it's all you hear about, B, the gospel is minimized, and C, anything goes when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to sin or sexual ethics in particular. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just want to ask you, does that even resemble your experience in these denominations?
Not really. It's funny. We just had somebody in one of our TMC groups the other day share that they felt frustrated because the church that they were at had offered up during the prayers of the people had offered up a prayer for transgender folks in a specific context. And so many of even though it's an affirming church, several members came up to the pastor afterward and said, "We can't talk about this so much because it'll be the only thing we talk about." It was the only time they had mentioned trans folks in like 6 months. But even once, people were like nervous about it. So that sense of like we're nervous that this will become the only thing our church is known for, that's very much within the mainline churches as well as outside it,
Hmm.
even though there's not really any evidence for that, which is one of the funny things is like
Interesting.
there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for that. And the churches that do make inclusion their whole thing are actually doing pretty well. I'm thinking of Cathedral of Hope in Dallas. Like they are known as the gay church, and they got so big they had to create a whole new campus.
Awesome.
So like the idea that like this is going to be the only thing we talk about is usually not true, not based in evidence. And two, for the churches that do want to make it their whole thing, doesn't actually turn out to be that bad in terms of numbers.
Sure.
But yeah, in terms of like, does it get in the way of other stuff? Is it minimizing the gospel? That sounds to me like a lot of what I heard growing up about like just a lot of concerns about like slippery slope, right? You'll take this, so then eventually this will happen. And in reality, it doesn't seem like that's I don't know. I think churches are, as much as we talk about denominations, individual churches are so different from each other that I don't feel like that's a huge concern. So you may go to a church and you're like, oh man, they're not really talking about, they're just talking about stuff that's going on in the world right now. And I don't really like that. You can go to the church down the street that's in the same denomination and they'll be completely different. So I don't know, strengths and weaknesses of denomination structures, I guess.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I mean, that church that you highlighted in Dallas, that's, you know, started a new campus in the gay church.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's something that I think I would be interested to hear what you think, Austin, because from my outsider's perspective and from the LGBTQ family members that we have in our church, I would say that the queer and trans community in general is a people group and a community that longs for Jesus, that
Mm-hmm.
longs for the message of the gospel, and loves it and is seeking it out. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think so first of all, I guess I would never lump all trans and gender expansive folks into any one bucket because really we are communities plural and not just one. But the folks that I know that want to be involved in Christian communities and that feel strongly about their faith do feel very strongly about finding a place that is theologically robust, right? That do care about good preaching, that do care about like how are we living this out? Um, so often when I go to churches and they're worried about becoming affirming, they're like, well, if we become affirming, we're going to lose members of our congregation. And my answer to that is always like, yes, you might lose some people, but you are also opening the door to a group of people that are extremely like pumped up about their faith and like want to be actively involved. So like realistically, you're going to have a whole group of new people coming in that are going to be so excited about this story that we are telling together and that we are part of that you're going to gain a lot more than you lose.
Yeah, and I can tell those listeners firsthand, it doesn't have to be that way. Like you
Mhm.
don't have to lose a huge group of your church, huge
Mhm.
part of your church if you go affirming. Um, it just has to be done. I think there's better ways to do that than others.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And moving together means moving slow often, and that's a difficult thing to do.
It sure is. It sure is.
Yeah. Anything before I ask the closing question?
I don't think so.
So your book came out 4 years ago. You've already kind of answered part of this question by telling us you're currently working on a second edition. 4 years in COVID time, and let's face it, in Trump time is pretty much like 27 years, give or take.
Yeah.
So what has changed for you in the 4 years since then? If there's anything besides the second edition you want to tell people about, where can they find that? Where can they look for your work? And also, and I guess this will be easy to answer since you're working on the second edition, what would you do differently, I guess, or what would you, with the benefit of the hindsight of the past 4 years, what would you have added or said differently, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is I just really felt strongly about writing and updating that gender language chapter because so much has changed. And I especially, I think like one line in the chapter on gender language. There's like one line explaining what it means to be non-binary, which is like drastically deficient. So I feel really excited about this new edition because it's much more helpful, I think, for folks that are in conversation with people today, which is not to say, that the old edition is bad. I'm still very proud of it. But I'm really excited about this new one coming out this spring. And in terms of where you can find it, it's everywhere. You can get it from your local bookstore. You can order it on Amazon, whatever you want to do. I love Bookshop. That's my go-to is bookshop.org. So yeah, you can get it anywhere and pre-order there. It'll come out in March. In terms of what I'm doing and where I'm, what I've been doing since the book came out, it's funny because the book was a logical next step from what I started doing, which was YouTube videos. I started doing YouTube videos in like 2012, something like that, because it was the easiest way to get information out to folks because trans folks were already on YouTube doing videos about their transition. So I was like, well, I'm here, like, let's talk about theology. And out of those YouTube videos came the book. And then when the book came out of that came a whole bunch of emails saying, where can I talk with other trans Christians about this? And so out of the book came what we have now, which is Transmission Ministry Collective, this organization that I work with. And really what we wanted to do was create a space. We talk about, we want to help people feel grounded, connected, and empowered. So grounded in who they are, grounded in their faith, offering that sort of theological education, feeling connected to other people, knowing that they're not alone out here, and then feeling empowered to lead in many cases. We have lots of folks who are going to seminary. We have lots of folks who are excited about becoming leaders in their local churches. So that community is one that I'm really proud of and really happy to be a part of. And we have some things that are specific for trans and gender expansive folks, like many of our support groups, but we also have some things that are open to anybody who wants to come. So we, for instance, have workshops once a month, and we have Bible studies on YouTube once a month, and those are open for anybody. So glad to have people come over.
Awesome. Well, again, Austen, we're so grateful you spent some time with us. The book, again, is Transforming, and you can get it wherever books are found, or you can wait until March and get the second edition, and you can find Austen all over the internet doing great work. Thank you so much, Austen, for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great fun.